Dualism is the view that everything is mental. Dualism is the view that there are two kinds of phenomena in the world, and it comes in a strong version and a weaker version. There's substance dualism and property dualism. Substance dualism being the view that in the world there are two kinds of substances or entities, physical entities and non-physical entities. We call them bodies and souls. This is the Cartesian view. Descartes was a famous defender of this position called substance dualism. The other kind of dualism says no such things as immaterial souls. All objects are physical, but some of these physical objects have two kind of properties, physical properties and mental properties, the mental ones being non-physical, right, such as believing, desiring, perceiving, feeling, all sorts of things, etc. And we talked a bit about, very, very briefly, about the two authors whose texts you'll be reading in this chapter. Descartes is a substance dualist, Jackson is a property dualist. Going back to the exercises. Question 2, right? It is precisely Descartes' view that the mind is an immaterial soul. The first one was false, the second one was true. Question 3, which of the things on the list stands out as not being part of the mind-body problem? Personal identity, very good. Personal identity and the mind-body problem are related metaphysical problems, but the former is not an aspect of the latter. They're different problems. Okay, please don't forget to submit your answers to get credit for that. And now we can move on to Descartes' defense of substance dualism. That's our next topic. Last time we had an introductory lecture. I familiarized you with the vocabulary philosophers use to characterize the relation between the mind and the body. I mentioned the main positions, and today we're looking at important arguments offered by Descartes in the 17th century for this very bold view in metaphysics, according to which the mind is an immaterial soul. It's not one and the same thing as your brain. It's distinct from the body and the brain, and it's very different from it in nature. It's immaterial. Doesn't exist in space. You can't perceive it. You can't detect it through your senses in any way. It's not even extended, as he puts it. That is, it doesn't exist in space at all. Okay. Trying to open the PowerPoint. I'd like to discuss 3 arguments offered by Descartes for substance dualism, and I hope, by the way, that you appreciated the fact I did not assign the 6th meditation in its entirety. This is where a lot of this stuff is presented. It's a very important meditation for the mind-body problem, but it's, as I said, long and also fairly complex. If you're interested in reading the whole thing, I'm happy to provide that to you. What I did instead is I posted a short handout with excerpts from the 6th meditation that have to do with the mind-body problem. And at the end of the handout, there's also a passage from a letter sent to Descartes by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia. In that passage, she raised what has become a very famous objection to Cartesian dualism. That was the reading, just 2 pages, much simpler, much shorter than the real thing. What are the 3 arguments that we'll talk about in support of substance dualism? I listed them here in a special order, and the order has to do with the fact that I'd like to save the most important of these arguments for the end. Most important and influential Cartesian argument for substance dualism is the so-called conceivability argument. Very, very influential in contemporary philosophy. The one that resembles structurally the zombie argument. We're going to come back to this comparison to the zombie argument at the very end of our discussion of Descartes. But we'll do that at the end. I want to start with 2 other arguments as a sort of warm-up, namely the argument from the indivisibility of the mind and the epistemic argument. This one's called epistemic because epistemology, the theory of knowledge, it has to do with knowledge, what the subject can and cannot know. The first two arguments are simpler in structure, and they may also very well be easier to attack, easier to evaluate than the third one, which is the most important. The first two arguments rely on a certain metaphysical principle called Leibniz's law. Leibniz was a German philosopher, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, who actually lived a little later than Descartes, in the second half of the 17th century, the beginning of the 18th. But this particular principle is associated in the literature with Leibniz's name. That's what we call it. Even though earlier philosophers such as Descartes knew about it and used it in their work. In the literature it's called Leibniz's. What does it say? It says something that seems obviously true. And that's not terribly controversial in philosophy either. It says that identical objects are always indiscernible. If A is identical to B, A and B must share in common all of their properties. In that sense, they're indiscernible. If they're really identical, everything that is true of A should be true of B, and vice versa. Everything that is true of B should likewise be true of A. Right? For example, as you know, Mark Twain was the pen name used by Samuel Clemens. These are different names for the same person. Suppose we find out that Mark Twain grew up in Missouri, which I think is true. Let's assume that is true for the sake of the argument. We learned that piece of information. Since these are one and the same person, it follows logically that Samuel Clemens must have grown up in Missouri too, right? Since Samuel Clemens and Mark Twain are identical in the numerical sense, they must be indiscernible. They must share in common all of their properties. Here's an equivalent way of stating Leibniz's law that is closer, if I want to put it like that, because that's the formulation that Descartes uses, right? It's closer to the way he states the principle in his first two arguments for the distinctness between the mind and the body. Logically equivalent way of stating the same principle. You're wondering about the relation between A and B. Are they one and the same thing? Are they not? And then you can find some distinguishing property. You can find a property which A possesses, but B does not. What follows logically in that case? If there is such a distinguishing property, then A and B can't be one and the same entity, right? They obviously must be distinct. Suppose that the crime is committed, it was murder, a few weeks ago somewhere in Houston. Somebody stabbed the victim to death, and the detective is wondering whether Stephen could have been the murderer. He's among the suspects, right? Is Stephen identical to the murderer? It later turns out that Stephen was at the time of the crime somewhere in Europe at a philosophy conference. Could he, in that case, be the murderer? Could he have been the murderer? You can't stab somebody to death from across the pond, right? So here's a property that Stephen possesses, but the murderer lacks. He was in Europe at the time of the crime. The murderer was not in Europe. He was in Houston. Therefore, Stephen is not identical to the murderer, right? So it sounds like a perfectly sensible principle, and it's the principle used by Descartes in his first two arguments for substance dualism. The first argument, think about the mind and the body. Could they be identical to each other? Descartes wonders. And he concludes they can't be identical. They can't be one and the same thing, because here's a distinguishing property. There's a property that the body possesses, but the mind lacks. What's that property? Being divisible into parts. The body is divisible into parts, while he says the mind is not. The mind is a simple entity, because it's the mind as a whole, he argues, that thinks, perceives, imagines, and so on. It's the mind as a simple object that does all of these things, rather than parts of the mind. QED, they can't be one and the same object because there's a difference in properties, right? They are not indiscernible from each other. Let's evaluate the argument a little bit. Which premise strikes you as the most problematic? one about the divisibility of the body or the other one? And if it's problematic, on what grounds?
Well, it's a little bit, well, for years, there's been like, if you take a look at like psychology, there have been times where people have tried to make the mind divisible. Like, I think Freud was probably one of the first people to really, well, I think he was one of the first people to really popularize it, I think. It was like, you know, the id, the ego, superego, you know, things like that. The consciousness, subconsciousness, that's where people, I think, try to divide, make the mind divisible, which I think does, in a way, challenge this.
Right, if you think about consciousness and the unconscious and so on as parts of the mind, right? Interesting, right, that's a controversial psychological theory, but think about the mental faculties which we possess, and that's not, it doesn't depend on any specific theory about how the mind works, right? Perception, thought, abstract thinking, the ability to experience emotions. Could we understand the various mental faculties as, in a sense, parts of the mind? And isn't it at least conceivable that you could lose some of these, at least one of them, while retaining the others? And it's not just conceivable, arguably it happens in real life, right? If bad stuff happens to your optic nerve, you might lose your ability to see things, but the other sensory modalities might remain intact, as well as your ability to think and so on. Or think about imaginary cases. I'm not sure if people still watch Star Trek these days, maybe not. Do you know about Mr. Data? Does that ring a bell? Mr. Data in Star Trek? He's supposed to have some kind of artificial intelligence, be extremely smart, right, able to reason abstractly, but completely incapable of feeling emotions. No emotions, but the other mental faculties are very similar to our own. Right, if you think of these as, in a sense, parts of the mind, then maybe we can say the mind is divisible into parts too, since you could lose some of these faculties, but the others might remain intact at the same time. Something to think about. So the questionable premise, the one where we would need more evidence, is this one. The mind is not divisible into parts. Not very impressive, at least not yet. Moving on to the second argument, the epistemic argument for the distinctness between the mind and the body. This argument relies again on Leibniz's law. Descartes says, here is another property which one of these entities has, but the other one lacks. What's the property? It's a complex epistemic property, meaning it has to do with knowledge. And this all goes back to what happens in the first two meditations. It all goes back to Descartes' attempt to solve the skeptical problem. Let's briefly refresh your memories of that, because that's directly relevant here. In the first two meditations, Descartes argues that he can be certain of the existence of his mind, but he cannot be certain of the existence of his body, right? For the familiar reasons. He might be deceived by a vision, or he might be dreaming right now, maybe his whole life has been a dream. But even if these skeptical scenarios turn out to be true, he must still exist, namely exist as a thinking entity. So then he reasons as follows. Here is another property which I can use to distinguish between my mind and my body. It's a property that my mind has this time, and the body lacks. What's that property? Being known to me to exist with certainty. Being known to me to exist with certainty. I can know that about the mind, but I can't know that about the body because of the familiar skeptical reasons. Therefore, they can't be one and the same entity, because there's something I know with certainty about the one that I do not know in the same way about the other. Is Leibniz's law intended to cover epistemic properties? Properties describing what the person knows or doesn't know. That's the key question here. Remember, when looking at the previous argument, we asked whether it was sound and we actually concentrated on the truth values of the premises. We didn't question the logical form of the argument. We concluded that this is problematic, possibly false. We needed more evidence here. Let's ask the validity question in connection with this. Is this a valid argument? Is it logically correct? Or could we use the counterexample method to prove that it's logically flawed, in fact, at least as it stands in this relatively simple formulation? Can you come up with a counterexample to this? Where you have one and the same entity described in two different ways, and when described like that, it possesses a certain epistemic property, but when described the other way, it lacks the same epistemic property. How about this? Mark Twain is identical to Samuel Clemens, right, as we all know. But there can be subjects who don't realize that. Susan, for instance. Mark Twain is known by Susan to have written Huckleberry Finn. Let's assume that's true. But Samuel Clemens is not known by Susan to have written Huckleberry Finn. She doesn't realize they're one and the same person. Are we entitled to conclude from these two pieces of information that Mark Twain and Samuel Clemens are numerically distinct? Simply because there's something she knows about the one that she doesn't know about the other. No, right? Invalid argument. True premises if you choose the right subject, this hypothetical Susan, for instance. False conclusion. Right? Leibniz's law is not intended to cover epistemic properties. This is a fairly common phenomenon. I may know that an object is thus and so under one name, but not know that the object is thus and so under a different name, when it's presented to me slightly differently. If I don't realize that the two modes of presentation pick out the same entity. So problem here, could the argument be fixed? Well, good question. We're not going to go into that. But I'd like you to bear this argument in mind when you read Jackson, because if the Cartesian conceivability argument is the ancestor of the zombie argument, this one is the ancestor of Jackson's famous knowledge argument. The knowledge argument is a lot more sophisticated, and very complex semantic machinery has been developed to address various objections, but this is where it comes from, essentially. It's inspired by this. And now, the most important argument, the conceivability argument for substance dualism. Let me draw a little picture, assuming that this works. Descartes wonders whether he is identical to his body. And remember this weird detail, potentially weird detail, that when he says I, he means to be referring to what? To his mind. Right? Am I identical to my body? That is my mind identical to my body? Question mark. We don't know that. The argument is intended to show that they're not one and the same. They're not identical. How does it begin? It begins with a premise about what is conceivable, meaning what we can imagine without contradiction. Conceivability means it's imaginable. It says I can conceive of myself, or my mind, existing without the body. I can conceive a scenario in which I am present and I have all sorts of complex thoughts about math, maybe logic, something very abstract, complex reasoning. I do all of that as a purely disembodied mind. I am present there, but the body, this one that I have in the actual world, is missing. Okay, is everybody on board, or are you already inclined to object? Can you conceive of your existing as a purely thinking mind, unattached to any physical body? You do a lot of thinking, but there's no body, no brain present.
Like, just because just because you can imagine something doesn't mean it's real. Like, I can imagine that, like, I don't know, pigs can fly, but they don't fly in real life.
Right, but it doesn't say that you exist in real life as a disembodied soul, right? So let's go through it slowly, step by step. Premise one, I can conceive of my existing without the body. My existing is a purely thinking thing that is disembodied. What does he mean here? Something very weak. It's important. That's why I keep stressing this the way I stressed it like when talking about zombies. What does it mean to say that something is conceivable? You can imagine it in a lot of detail without contradiction, without any incoherence. Think about the notion that you exist, have thoughts, experiences, and so on, that there is no associated body. Is that similar to the notion of a married bachelor? Doesn't seem so. Is it similar to the notion of a round square? No, right? It does make some sense, at least on the face of it. If you think that there is an incoherence, then you need to bring it to light, right? Because there doesn't seem to be any incoherence. Okay, so what, right? Very general claim about conceivability. How is that going to get us to a metaphysical conclusion, a very strong metaphysical conclusion, namely about the distinctness between the mind and the body? By introducing next a bridge principle connecting what is conceivable to what is possible, not really to what is real, or exactly to what is real, but to what is, in some relevant sense of the term, possible. That's exactly what he says, right? I should mention that the argument is presented by me in a slightly simplified fashion, and I've also couched it in contemporary vocabulary to be able to demonstrate more easily the continuity between this and what happens in contemporary literature. So, therefore, since my existing as a disembodied mind, thinking disembodied mind is conceivable, that is also possible in a very broad sense of this term. Not in the sense that that happens in the actual world, that in the actual world there are disembodied minds that can think, even though there's no associated brain or body, but in the sense that God could have created something like that. In particular, God could have created me in such a state, in a disembodied state. Right? There's a possible world, in other words, in which I exist, I am present, I do a lot of thinking, but the body is absent. Right? There's a possible world corresponding to this coherent scenario which I've conceived of. This is the actual world, and this is another possible world. Another world which God could have actualized. Right? He could have created a world like this instead of creating the world that he did. And we're still, it seems, pretty far away from the conclusion that the mind is distinct from the body. How do we get there? Well, here's how. In this alternative possible world, I can't be identical to the body because I'm there, but the body is absent. Right? There's no identity here between me and the body. This is a world in which I exist, but the body doesn't. But if I'm not identical to the body here, I couldn't possibly be identical to the body in the actual world either, because identity relations, if they hold at all, hold necessarily, hold across the entire realm of possibilities. No identity here means no identity in the actual world either. Therefore, I, or the mind, am distinct from the body. The mind is an immaterial soul. How are we doing? If you don't like the conclusion, which is completely understandable, right, because it's a fairly strong metaphysical position, you need to find the problem somewhere in the argument. One option is to go back to the conceivability plane and insist that that must be false somehow. There is a hidden contradiction somewhere in our description of that scenario. A more promising strategy, something that is more likely to succeed, would be to grant premise one and challenge the link between what is conceivable and what is possible. Do you want to talk about that at all? Do you have any ideas or any questions about it for that matter?
I I guess what's confusing to me is that even if it is conceivable, and like if you said conceivable versus possible, even if it's conceivable but not possible, like why does it matter?
Right, but could it be conceivable and not possible, given how much we've weakened the notion of possibility? Possibility doesn't mean it could be part of this world. It doesn't mean it's something you could run into tomorrow, one of these disembodied thinkers, right? It just means God could have created a world like that instead. Remember the discussion about zombies? Let's bring that up now because it's a good time to do so. How does this differ from the zombie argument, and how is it similar to the zombie argument? I can show that to you again. It's at the end of the previous PowerPoint. Right here. They both start with a claim about what's conceivable, don't they? They both continue with a bridge principle connecting what's conceivable to what's possible. And they both end with a claim about the nature of the mind. Right here, you have consciousness is not physical. That's some type of dualism too, but it's property dualism. Conscious states are not physical states. Right, but we're not saying that they're states of a non-physical substance, which is the Cartesian conclusion. So the conclusion is weaker here than in Descartes' case. The structure of the argument seems to be very similar. What's the striking difference, though, if you look at the premises? What are you asked to conceive of? Your zombie twin was a molecule for molecule duplicate of you, lacking consciousness. What Descartes is talking about is you, is you as a thinking entity without the body.
So it's like the inverse.
Exactly, right. So Chalmers invites you to imagine all your physical aspects unaccompanied by consciousness. We imagine the physical without the mental. And the most we can get from such an argument is the conclusion that mental states are not identical to the physical states that you thereby imagined. Descartes asks you to imagine you as a thinking entity, that whole mental life still going on in the absence of the body. And the conclusion that he hopes to get is that that mental life doesn't inhere in any sort of physical substance, since it could very well go on without it, or it could exist without it. But the structure of the argument is identical, and the essential concepts, what's conceivable, what's possible, are the same. Any further thoughts on this? Cartesian dualism is not simply substance dualism. The type of dualism defended by Descartes is a little more complex than that. Namely, Descartes also gives an argument for interactionism. And in fact, this is how we're going to use these terms in our course. Let me pull this down. For Cartesian dualism, this label refers not just to substance dualism, but to substance dualism plus interactionism. There are two components to it. What is interactionism? Remember our discussion of the mind-body problem, and specifically of its fourth facet. The mind and the body causally interact, and they do that all the time. This is common sense. That's precisely what the term interactionism refers to, the commonsensical view, namely, that there's two-way causal interaction between our minds and our bodies. This is something that Descartes wants to incorporate into his philosophy. Not only is he a substance dualist, but he thinks it's right to say that sometimes mental changes undergone by the soul cause physical changes in the body, and vice versa. Other times, the physical changes occurring in the body cause mental changes in this non-physical substance that supposedly does the thinking for us. Right? So he's an interactionist. An interactionist will draw two arrows here between the mind and the body, because there's causation in both directions. What will be some examples really quickly of causation from the mind to the body and the other way around? We've already given quite a few examples of that. I get a cut, that's a physical change in my body. What is it that usually happens as a result? It hurts, I feel pain, right? causation from the body to the mind. I decide to raise my arm. I'm not paralyzed. I don't suffer from any disorder that might prevent me from acting on my decision, right? As a result, my arm goes up. That's causation from the mind to the body. The decision is a mental event and the action is a physical event. Or I have a headache, I take Advil. My headache goes away. Causation again from the physical to the mental, etc., etc. Do you have your favorite example of causation of either type that you'd like to bring in? Yes.
I have to say this. For years, I think in psychology, people have been trying to determine if it's like what you said, if it's our physical, like things that physically happen to us that cause our emotion. Like, for example, like I start to feel sweaty and make my palms start to feel sweaty. I start to shake and I feel anxious. Well, some people think it's the other way around. I feel anxious, my palms get sweaty, I start shaking. So it kind of reminds me of that, to where it's like, and for years they've been trying to figure out, well, which of these comes first? Is it the physical symptoms or is it the emotion?
And it may also be a very unpleasant cycle from a certain point on.
And
right? Yeah.
And for some, I don't know, for some things maybe it's the emotion that starts first. For other things maybe it's, I feel like maybe it's just a little more nuanced, personally. Like for some things maybe, like for some things, like for example the paper cut you mentioned, that's an example of a physical symptom causing an emotional response. But you know, sometimes you just sort of feel bad and then you start having physical symptoms.
Which make you feel even worse, right? Yeah, right. So you're not challenging any of these arrows, right? We're just saying that in some cases it's hard to figure out what the direction of the arrow is. But common sense would say, and it sounds like you would agree, that there is causation in both directions, right? Sometimes physical changes in the body cause a mental change, other times it's the other way around. And it's true that in some cases it may be hard to correctly identify the cause and the effect, right? Which one caused which. Good. Descartes wants to be an interactionist. His official position is that the mind is an immaterial soul. It's numerically distinct from the body. It's not physical. And it causally interacts with the body. But doesn't that raise a huge problem for him? Trying to be both a substance dualist and an interactionist. This is Princess Elizabeth's objection from that little quote at the end of the handout, which I actually like to read typically. So let's go to that. Descartes handout. It's at the very end. Okay, here's how she puts it. I beg of you to tell me how the human soul can determine the movement of the animal spirits in the body so as to perform voluntary acts, being as it is merely a conscious substance. For the determination of movement seems always to come about from the moving body's being propelled, to depend on the kind of impulse it gets from what sets it in motion, or again, on the nature and shape of this latter thing's surface. Now, the first two conditions involve contact. How could the soul come into contact with the brain if it's not even physical? The first two conditions involve contact, and the third involves that the impelling thing has extension. Extension means it takes up space, and it's extended in space. But you utterly exclude extension from your notion of soul, and contact seems to me incompatible with the things being immaterial. The point here is, if the soul really is fully immaterial, not extended, doesn't exist in space, right? It only exists in time. Can we understand how the immaterial soul could possibly causally interact with the physical body? If these two substances are so radically different, one is purely non-physical, the other is purely physical, how could they possibly causally interact? How could a decision, right, a change in your immaterial soul, affect the physical states of your brain so as to cause your arm to go up like that? And also vice versa. How would some neural event occurring in the brain cause a change to happen in your immaterial soul? The ordinary model we have for physical causation, the one we apply to physical entities, involving pushing and pulling, is not applicable here. The soul couldn't push, couldn't do any pushing or pulling, right? Because it's not physical. It couldn't touch the brain, it couldn't come into contact with the brain to alter its states. How does that happen exactly? It sounds like a mystery. Descartes' response is not terribly satisfying. Namely, he insists that the causal interaction between the mind and the body occurs right here in the pineal gland. That's where it all happens. That's the locus of causal interaction between our physical body and our non-physical soul. Claiming that it happens there, of course, goes no way toward explaining how it could happen. So, very significant problem that Cartesian dualism runs into because of Descartes' attempt to reconcile substance dualism and interactionism. It begins to look as though he might be trying to have his cake and eat it too. They're very different in kind and they causally interact. Let's look at a passage, a famous passage from the Sixth Meditation, in which he characterizes precisely this causal relation between the mind and the body in a lot of detail to see how he's thinking of it exactly. Okay, I'm trying to start the damn show. Quick exercise for you to do in groups. Let's read the passage first, though, and the questions are at the bottom. It draws a comparison here that's very well known between the mind-body relation and that between a sailor and his ship. What is this all about? What does he mean here? How are these two relations, sailor, ship, mind-body, similar as well as different from each other? Nature teaches me, he writes, by the sensations of pain, hunger, thirst, and so on, that I am not merely present in my body as a sailor is present in a ship, but that I am very closely joined and as it were intermingled with it, so that I and the body form a unit. If this weren't so, I, who am nothing but a thinking thing, would feel pain when the body was hurt, but would perceive the damage purely by the intellect, just as a sailor perceives by sight if anything in his ship is broken. Similarly, when the body needed food or drink, I should have an explicit understanding of the fact, instead of having confused sensations of hunger and thirst. For these sensations of hunger, thirst, pain, etc., are nothing but confused modes of thinking which arise from the union and, as it were, intermingling of the mind with the body. Okay? Could you please think about those questions and discuss them in groups for a few minutes?
Basically, the mind is basically this person saying that the body is the one thing. Exactly.
Are you looking at the story?
Well, that's why he calls it other thing.
There you go.
Put them in a wedge where they don't dig into my heels.
And you're making fun of him for not remembering.
Close to them.
Like they wouldn't let you. Well, they wouldn't let it be final transcript from the high school. No, I haven't. But they already, they took it off from their script.
Right, so the mind,
I have like all the
body,
ones.
like,
I have two, I have one for CSI, I have one for
the
the,
mind knows about
and then there's
Well,
another
they
one.
took off the high
damage
school.
or the injury that the body can sustain.
Oh, I can never remember my name, and then return it, and they
But
just
the
like,
question is
like,
emphasizing the severity. Is he struck by how they're similar to each other or how they're different? Okay. How does the comparison go? And what is it that Descartes stresses in this passage? How the two relations, I don't want to give it away, how the two relations are similar or how they're different from each other. How does the sailor find out that the ship is damaged and needs to be fixed because otherwise it's going to drown? Right, he observes that. He uses his sensory organs to find that out, and then he fixes it how? Just by wishing that to happen? We're assuming he's not a magician, right? By using tools or at least his own hands to fix the ship. How about the mind-body relation? How do you find out that you got injured? By visually inspecting your body, and you see, oops, lots of blood here. I better do something about it. That can happen too, right? But usually that's not how you find out. How do you find out that you got injured? It hurts, right? Through the feeling of pain. And how do you fix things, or how do you change the state of your own body? Do you need tools to do so? If you want your right arm to go up like that, do you need to raise it with your other arm, paralysis aside? No, simply by intending it, right? You intend for that to happen, and as a result, it happens right away. The emphasis in the passage is on the differences between these two relations. There's causal interaction, two-way causal interaction in both cases, both in the sailor-ship relation and in the mind-body relation. But how's the causal interaction between the mind and the body special and different from the other one? It's special and different, according to Descartes, because it's direct, immediate. There's no need for intermediaries, such as tools or sensory organs one needs to use to perceive what happened. The causal interaction between the mind and the body is supposed to be a sort of intermingling of the two. And doesn't that make the problem raised by Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia even worse, even harder to solve? How could something purely physical and something purely non-physical be involved in this kind of very intimate causal relation? Not only do they causally interact, but it is as though they were intermingled. Doesn't that make it even harder to understand? Okay, serious problem for Descartes, and a problem that impressed later philosophers. I want to mention just two of them, so it becomes as clear as possible to you that this is a serious problem. Later philosophers such as Leibniz and Malebranche, who were substance dualists, felt compelled to reject interactionism on these grounds. This is the Leibniz who discussed that more that I introduced at the beginning of lecture. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, German philosopher from the second half of the 17th century, and who died at the beginning of the 18th in 1716. Nicolas Malebranche, French philosopher who died in the same year as Leibniz, so a little later than Descartes. They were substance dualists, but they agreed with Princess Elizabeth, that you can't coherently be both a substance dualist and an interactionist. So they claimed that there's no causal interaction between the mind and the body. But if you reject interactionism, if you cross out these arrows, right, because you think that these are radically different substances which can't causally affect each other's states, you have a lot of explaining to do, don't you? You need to explain all of these correlations that we observe between mental events and physical events. If there's no causation between the mind and the body, how come that whenever I get a cut, I feel pain? And how come that whenever I take Advil for a headache, the headache goes away? Right? And how come that whenever I decide to walk around, I am able to do so, and that's exactly what I do next. It's called these psychophysical correlations. That is, correlations between physical events and psychological or mental events that occur all the time. There are these interesting regularities, right? Whenever, other things being equal, whenever you get injured, it's a serious injury, you feel pain. Whenever you make a decision, other things being equal, there's the relevant behavior right after that. What's the explanation? It can't be causation. For an interactionist, right, that's very easy to explain. Why do these correlations occur all the time? Because there's causation between the two substances. The mental change causes the physical change. The decision causes my arm to go up, right? And the injury to the body causes a brain event which causes the feeling of pain. But that answer is not available to somebody like Leibniz and Malebranche because they're not interactionists. What these guys did is they invoked God, of course. That's very convenient, was for modern philosophers. When they got into trouble philosophically, they could always use God to get them out of trouble. The theory defended by Leibniz is called pre-established harmony. And the theory defended by Malebranche is called occasionalism, from the word occasion. I'm not presenting them because I think they're particularly convincing. They're not. Right? To a contemporary reader, they might sound ridiculous. But they're very ingenious attempts to explain psychophysical interaction under the assumption that, not psychophysical interaction, but psychophysical correlations, under the assumption that interactionism is not an option. What did Leibniz say? What he said, there is, of course, no causal interaction between the soul and the body. But the reason why these mental events are always correlated with the corresponding physical events is that both the body and the soul were created by God in a special way. Namely, God made sure at the beginning when he created both that they would be in perfect harmony with each other throughout their histories. He made sure that they would always mirror each other. Here's an analogy that's often used to explain Leibniz's view, try to make it a bit more intuitive. Imagine a clockmaker who manufactures two clocks, right? And they always show the same time, let's assume. Why do they show the same time? Is it because they somehow affect each other's states causally? The state of the one causes the state of the other. No, these are two separate clocks with nothing to do with each other. The reason why they always show the same time is that they were synchronized by the manufacturer at the beginning, and they were also created in such a way as to work very accurately and show the same time for as long as possible, right? So that harmony between them has to do with how they were created at the beginning. It doesn't have anything to do with a potential interaction between them subsequently. This is the pre-established harmony view. And then the other one, Malebranche defended, as I said, occasionalism. He held the more radical view that in fact only God can be a cause. God is the only cause in the universe. He didn't believe in causal interaction between physical bodies either. He didn't think that that was possible. No physical interaction between created substances. God is the only cause. And so why exactly is it again that when I decide to raise my arm, that's what I do next? Right? Why are these events, the physical and the mental, correlated like that? Well, it's because God steps in and does the causing. He notices that I formed the decision, yes, and then he intervenes and causes the physical event. Why is it that when I get injured, I feel pain? It's not that the change in my body causes a corresponding change in my mind. It's again, rather that God steps in and does the causing. Like the injury occurs and God causes me to feel pain. He's a very busy God.
So
There's a lot of stuff for him to do.
So God pushed me to the floor and caused me to face plant, basically, is what he's saying. If I get hurt, if that's how I get injured.
I'm sorry, can you say that again? God did what?
You're saying if like I fall and so if like I trip and I face plant on the floor, you're saying God pushed me, basically?
Okay, right, so let's just talk about the relations between the mind and the body, right? So we're not giving an explanation of why you fell. That involves physical events, because he has other reasons to deny causal interaction between physical entities. What we're concentrating on here is just the relation between the mind and the body, right? You fell like that, why you did, that's a separate question, and that hurt is the way we would put it, right? You felt pain. My wife would say it's not your impact with the floor, it's not the physical changes occurring in the body that caused that, it's God who caused that. Yeah. Again, I'm not presenting this because it's plausible, but only to show you that these philosophers went to great lengths to avoid commitment to interactions. They sought other explanations for psychophysical correlation, not causal interaction. They didn't think that that was possible between a physical body and an immaterial soul. How are we doing? Which of these two arguments, the two conceivability arguments, do you like better, if any, and on what grounds? The one for the stronger substance dualist conclusion, or the one for the weaker property dualist conclusion? The zombie argument. Conscious states and properties are not physical states and properties. Nobody says, though, that you have an immaterial soul. Or are you physicalist? You don't like either of those. You're suspicious of both. Do you want to say something? You can think about it some more and get back to us if you'd like. Are you physicalist? That is, do you think that mental state is in fact? In which case, there should be a mistake somewhere, at least one, right, in all of these arguments we've looked at, both in the zombie argument and in Descartes' conceivability argument. What clarificatory questions do you have for me then? Because if you're not willing to engage in conversation, that may be a sign that some important aspects of these arguments aren't fully clear.
I'm just a little more inclined towards like functionalism, if that's a bit further ahead.
Yeah, we haven't talked about functionalism. Right, there are many kinds of physicalism. Physicalism is a very popular view these days, and some physicalists identify mental states with relatively simple first order level, as it were, physical properties, while others, the functionalists, identify them with higher level physical properties that have to do with how the brain functions rather than relatively simple physical properties instantiated by individual neurons. I haven't introduced this distinction in the intro yet. Yeah. We're going to talk a bit about a special form of functionalism when we get to artificial intelligence computationalism, but that's in the future. Is the mind physical? Is it not physical? Are mental states, pains, beliefs, desires, perceptions, physical states or not? Your next reading is Frank Jackson, a very important 20th century and 21st century philosopher. While we're at it, I should define one of the central terms used in the title of the paper and the title of that paper, epiphenomenalism. Okay, so the interaction is we draw two arrows here, as you know, and then defenders of the pre-established harmony view or of occasionalism would cross out both arrows, thinking that it's impossible for the two substances to interact fully at all. What is epiphenomenalism? Epiphenomenalism is a view espoused, for example, by Frank Jackson. Jackson would keep one of these arrows and erase the other one. Which one would he keep? Body to mind, very good. He thinks of mental states, conscious states in particular, as being caused by the brain. So he would keep the arrow from the body/brain to the mind. Consciousness is generated by the physical processes happening in the brain, in his view. But it's epiphenomenal, meaning it's just a byproduct of those physical processes. It's caused by them, but it itself is causally impotent. Mental states, conscious states in particular, can't have any physical effects, according to Jackson. So he would erase the arrow from the mind to the body. He's a property dualist. That is, for him, mental states are non-physical states of the brain rather than of some weird immaterial substance. So do you have any idea yet where you stand on this? Physicalism, everything is physical, both the entities and their properties and states, versus some kind of dualism. I wouldn't dare bring up idealism. I don't think that there are that many idealists around these days. But physicalism or dualism, a duality, if not of things, which is Descartes' view, then at least a duality of properties and states. Do you think that everything in the end can be explained in physical terms? We just haven't got there yet, but in principle that should be possible. Including the way that it's like to have conscious experiences. Quality. Okay, lots of stuff to think about. I'm not gonna put additional pressure